Hello marine biology students. In this video we're going to talk about the intertidal zone and the challenges of living in this marine environment. The intertidal zone is the area between the mean low tide and the mean high tide. By contrast, the subtidal zone is the area that is always submerged, even at low tide. The intertidal zone will be exposed during low tide. There are a variety of different types of substrate. Or bottom that make up the intertidal zones. The intertidal zone substrate can be rocky or made of a softer material. Soft bottoms can vary from sand to silt or a mixture of mud. And we can see the size gradient from sand being a more coarse substrate down to silt and clay, which make up mud. Rocky substrates can vary as to the type of rock and the slope of the angle. In the lower picture, we see a gravel beach, a volcanic gravel beach in Hawaii. The gravel is hard and much larger than sand, yet far more movable than a solid volcanic rock would be. When we look at the organisms that are living in the intertidal, they are either going to be epifauna, living on the surface of the substrate. So these could be snails that are living on the surface of the mud, or barnacles living on the surface of rocks. Also a variety of different types of algae and seaweeds and other organisms living on the surface. Infauna will be organisms living buried within the substrate. These could be burrowing clams in a soft bottom, or even certain types of tube worms that are interspersed down into the rocks themselves. And then the last category are the meiofauna. And the meiofauna are the organisms that are so small that they actually live between the grains of sand in soft substrate. These organisms can be sessile or modal. For a marine organism, the intertidal is a very harsh place to live, and there are many challenges that must be faced living in this environment. These challenges are the result of being exposed to air regularly, and also the wave action of the water. These challenges can include desiccation or water loss, temperature change, salinity changes, interrupted feeding, wave action and tides, oxygen availability, buildup of CO2, and also just limited space. Many of these challenges are not seen in other marine environments. They are unique to the intertidal, and unique challenges that intertidal organisms need to be able to deal with. And so the first of these, desiccation. When exposed, the intertidal organism must deal with potential water loss. Water loss will be more pronounced. On hot, dry, or windy days, organisms can deal with the potential water loss either by hiding or by clamming up. So as we look at these strategies, hiding may involve moving to a tide pool or an area with more moisture. This would be the case for modal organisms. Hiding may also mean that some organisms only live in areas where moisture will remain. Even when the tide is out, such as crevices in rock or deeper spots in soft bottoms. So things like algae, these seaweeds, they might only be growing in the little pockets or cracks or crevices where at least some water remains even during low tide, and the absence of these algae growing on the surrounding rocks has more to do with the inability for algae to survive on those rocks during low tide. Clamming up occurs with those organisms that have protective shells or valves, and they can be closed within their environment. In that way, they can conserve moisture, yet while moisture can be conserved this way, there is a downside. No gas exchange can occur, and no feeding can occur. So oxygen might be used up, carbon dioxide will build up, and these organisms have a reduced amount of time during the day to obtain the nutrients they need for their survival. Most marine environments are marked by very stable temperatures, but that's not the case for the intertidal. Most marine organisms are not used to significant temperature fluctuations. Yet again, this is not true for organisms in the intertidal. The wide range of temperatures that must be tolerated by organisms in the intertidal can be severe, and so only those organisms that can handle these temperature fluctuations will continue to be found there. Some organisms have mechanisms to help stay cool, such as the white shell of this Latornia snail. Many other snails of this species have a darker pigmentation to their shell, but these are snails that will often be exposed during low tide, and their shell color might allow them to stay cooler, even if it makes them more obvious to predators. Another factor that can change quite dramatically in the intertidal is salinity. This variation in salinity can be due to evaporation within the tide pools, or even freshwater precipitation in the form of rain. In fact, a heavy rainstorm can sometimes be very damaging to organisms in the intertidal if it occurs during low tide. Normal ocean salinity is around 33 to 35 parts per thousand. Estuarine salinity can vary between 5 to 30 parts per thousand. We can see that tide pools will vary even more. Organisms in the intertidal are normally euryhaline, meaning they can tolerate wide varieties of salinities, whereas subtidal organisms, by contrast, are normally stenohaline. And they do not tolerate variations in salinity well. For an intertidal organism, the salinity may vary greatly in the course of a single day, starting at 20 to 25 parts per thousand due to freshwater addition in the form of rain, but then climbing dramatically throughout the day due to evaporation and water loss when the intertidal is exposed. Salinity may also drop during the day due to a sudden influx of fresh water provided by a passing rainstorm. A salinity change of possibly 20 parts per thousand or more, combined with a temperature change of 40 or more degrees, may occur. These would be hellish changes for most marine organisms, and this is why the intertidal is a very harsh environment for an organism to survive in. And yet, even though these are severe, these aren't the only challenges for living in the intertidal. Interrupted feeding was mentioned previously. If an organism clams up, feeding will stop. Feeding will also stop for filter feeding organisms when they're exposed to air. In fact, there are very few organisms in the intertidal that can continue to feed during low tide, although snails are some of them. For intertidal communities which experience semi-diurnal tides, an animal could spend nearly half of their day exposed and not feeding. The next challenge to consider has to do with wave activity. Wave exposure can be a problem for intertidal organisms, either from physical damage of the waves themselves or the waves actually moving around parts of the substrate, such as loose rock or gravel, that can shear and scrape and pulverize organisms living in the intertidal. Some organisms are able to deal with this wave motion, but if the wave motion is too extreme, they may not be able to feed properly, and they may not be able to behave in a manner similar to neighboring intertidal organisms living in a sheltered bay. Rocky shores are often exposed to significant wave action. Not just the animals, but even the algae has to be able to tolerate the intense forces of wave action, and only those organisms that are sturdy and hardy enough to do so will be able to live in the intertidal. Gas exchange is another challenge to be aware of. Oxygen can be exhausted internally. If an organism clams up during low tide, it can also be exhausted in tide pools if there's a high density of organisms. Surprisingly, even algae at night when there's no photosynthesis. So if there's a lot of algae in tide pools at night, they are actually using up the oxygen instead of contributing oxygen, and that can result to very low oxygen levels in these tide pools. Carbon dioxide can also build up if there's excessive respiration. Some tide pool organisms have evolved the ability to exchange gases in both air and water, although for most marine organisms, gas exchange happens exclusively within the water, with non-fish marine vertebrates being an exception there. Another challenge of the intertidal has to do with limited space. In some intertidal communities, space may be limited. This is particularly true in the rocky intertidal, where surface area is limited. Space can also be limited in soft-bottomed communities, where many organisms select hard substrates such as oyster reefs to prevent being washed away. This particular image actually shows an artificial tide pool, but the capacity at which it is stocked showed just how tightly some tide pools may end up being crammed. Space is clearly a limiting factor for all of these predatory sea stars and anemones. And this completes our discussion of the challenges of living in the intertidal zone. We're going to see how these challenges result in what's called zonation of the intertidal zone. And as a question to think about before our next video, what factors do you think go into deciding where you live? All right. See you in the next video.